Before we begin this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our heartwarming stories. Now, let's begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as James Patterson adjusted his bearskin cap for what would be one of his final times. He had served as a royal guard for 12 years, standing watch over the British royal family with unwavering dedication. His record was spotless, his posture perfect, and his commitment absolute. Nothing in his military training had prepared him for what would happen on that ordinary Tuesday in September. James came from a long line of soldiers. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and James had always dreamed of following in their footsteps. When he was selected for the elite Queen's Guard at 23, his family had celebrated for days. It was the highest honor a soldier could achieve in ceremonial duty, standing motionless for hours, enduring tourists trying to make him laugh, protecting the royal family with his life if necessary. These were not just duties, but sacred responsibilities that James took to heart. That September morning started like any other. James arrived at the barracks at 5 in the morning, pressed his uniform until every crease was razor sharp, and polished his boots until they gleamed like black mirrors. The other guards nodded their greetings, men he had served alongside for years. They were brothers in arms, bound by tradition and honor. None of them knew that by the end of the day, everything would change for James. Prince George, the young heir to the throne, was visiting Windsor Castle with his family. At 10 years old, he was already being groomed for his future role as king. The public saw him at official events, always well-dressed and polite, waving to crowds with practiced ease. But behind palace walls, George was still a child with curiosity, kindness, and a heart that noticed things others missed. James took his position at the North Terrace. Standing guard outside a corridor the royal family would pass through that afternoon. His rifle was positioned precisely, his face set in the neutral expression that had become second nature. Hours passed. His legs ached, sweat trickled down his back under the heavy uniform, but he did not move. This was his duty. This was his honor. Around 3 in the afternoon, he heard footsteps approaching. Through his peripheral vision, he could see the royal family walking down the corridor. Prince William and Princess Catherine walked ahead, discussing something in low tones. Behind them, Prince George walked with his younger siblings. The children were animated, pointing at paintings and asking questions. James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. As the family passed, something unexpected happened. Prince George stopped walking. James could sense the young prince standing just a few feet away, studying him. The other guards had warned him about this. Sometimes the royal children were curious about the guards, these silent sentinels who stood like statues. The protocol was clear: do not move, do not speak, do not acknowledge them in any way. But George did not move on. The young prince stood there for what felt like an eternity. James could hear Princess Catherine gently calling for George to catch up, but the boy said something quietly to his mother. Then, James heard footsteps approaching again. This time, they stopped right in front of him. What happened next would haunt James for the rest of his life, not with sadness, but with a profound sense of shame and revelation. Through his fixed gaze, he saw small hands appear in his line of sight. Prince George was standing directly before him now, and the young prince was doing something that made James's heart stop. The 10-year-old carefully and deliberately placed a bottle of water at James's feet. Not carelessly, not as a prank, but with genuine concern. Then George stepped back, and in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried the weight of true compassion, he said something that shattered James's composed exterior. The words were simple, but they cut through 12 years of military conditioning like a knife through silk. James felt his eyes begin to sting, something that had not happened since his first week of basic training. His throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain his composure, to remain the perfect, emotionless guardian he had been trained to be. But in that moment, standing before a child who had noticed his humanity when James himself had almost forgotten it, something broke inside him. Not in a destructive way, but like a dam that had held back too much for too long. He realized that in becoming the perfect soldier, the perfect guard, the perfect protector, he had lost something essential. He had become so focused on duty that he had forgotten why duty mattered in the first place. Prince George rejoined his family, looking back once with those perceptive young eyes. The royal family continued their walk, unaware of the earthquake that had just occurred in one guard's soul. James stood there for the remaining 2 hours of his shift, the bottle of water at his feet, his mind racing through memories and revelations he could no longer suppress. When his replacement arrived at 5 o'clock, James saluted and marched back to the barracks with mechanical precision. But inside, everything had changed. That night, he sat in his small room and wrote a letter that would end his military career. James sat at the small wooden desk in his quarters, staring at the blank paper before him. His pen trembled slightly in his hand, something that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Royal guards did not tremble. They did not waver. They were pillars of strength and discipline. Yet here he was, shaking like a leaf, all because a 10-year-old boy had shown him kindness. The barracks were quiet around him. Most of the other guards were in the common room, watching television or playing cards. James could hear their laughter filtering through the walls, sounds of camaraderie he had enjoyed for over a decade. Tomorrow, those sounds would no longer be part of his life. Tomorrow, he would be someone else entirely. He thought back to the moment when Prince George had placed that water bottle at his feet. The gesture itself was simple, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But the awareness behind it, the empathy that had driven a young prince to notice a guard's discomfort and do something about it, had struck James like a lightning bolt. How long had he been standing there in the heat? 3 hours? 4? He honestly could not remember anymore. The ability to ignore his body's needs had become so ingrained that he barely registered thirst, hunger, or fatigue. But George had noticed. A child had seen what James had trained himself to ignore. The young prince had looked at him not as a ceremonial fixture, not as a tourist attraction, not as a symbol, but as a human being who might need help. That recognition had shattered something fundamental in James's understanding of himself. He began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster as 12 years of suppressed feelings poured onto the page. He wrote about his pride in serving, about the honor he felt wearing the uniform, about the dedication that had driven him to perfection. But he also wrote about the cost, the missed birthdays and weddings, the relationships that had withered because he was always on duty, always committed, always putting service above everything else. He wrote about his younger sister's graduation that he had missed because he could not get leave. He wrote about his father's heart attack last year, and how James had stood guard at Buckingham Palace while his mother sat alone in a hospital waiting room. He had told himself these sacrifices were noble, that duty demanded such commitment. But Prince George's simple act of kindness had forced him to ask a question he had been avoiding for years. At what point did dedication become self-destruction? The irony was not lost on James. He was resigning because someone had shown him kindness, because someone had reminded him that he was human. In any other profession, this would sound absurd. But in the military, especially in ceremonial duties, humanity was often seen as weakness. Guards were supposed to be above human needs, immune to discomfort, utterly dedicated to their role. James had excelled at being inhuman, and it had nearly destroyed him. He remembered a conversation with his father years ago. Shortly after James had been selected for the Queen's Guard, his father, weathered by years of military service, had gripped his shoulder and said something that James had not fully understood at the time. Son, never forget why we serve. It's not about the uniform or the medals. It's about protecting people, about being there for those who need us. The day you forget that is the day you need to walk away. James had nodded, young and eager, thinking he understood, but he had not understood at all. He had focused on the how of serving, perfecting every aspect of his duties, while losing sight of the why. Prince George had reminded him of the why in the most unexpected way possible. The young prince had not seen a guard. He had seen a person who needed water, and he had helped. And it was that simple and that profound. As James continued writing, he realized his resignation was not about giving up. It was about remembering who he was beneath the uniform. 4:12. Years he had been Guard Patterson, a man who could stand motionless for hours, who never complained, who never showed weakness. But before that, he had been James Patterson, a boy who wanted to help people, who had joined the military because he believed in service. It's not because he wanted to become a statue. The letter grew longer. He thanked his commanding officers for the opportunity to serve. He expressed his deep respect for the institution and his fellow guards. He explained that his decision was not made lightly or in anger, but with careful consideration and a full heart. He did not mention Prince George by name. That moment was too personal, too sacred to put into an official document. But he wrote about recognizing the need to reclaim his humanity, to remember that being a good soldier meant being a good person first. When he finally finished, it was past midnight. James read through the letter 3 times, making small corrections, ensuring his words conveyed respect rather than bitterness. This was not a rejection of his service, but an acknowledgement that his service had taken him down a path he needed to step away from. He sealed the envelope and placed it on his desk, where he would see it first thing in the morning. Sleep did not come easily that night. James lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, memories flooding through him. His first day in uniform, standing so straight he thought his spine might snap. The pride in his mother's eyes when she saw him at his passing out parade. Grueling training that had forged him into an elite guard. The first time he stood watch at Buckingham Palace, overwhelmed by the weight of history and responsibility. But he also remembered the gradual numbness that had crept in. The way he had stopped feeling the cold or heat. The way he had learned to ignore pain, thirst, and exhaustion. The way he had slowly become less like a protector and more like a prop. Prince George's kindness had been a wake-up call. A reminder that somewhere along the way, James had lost himself in the role. Morning came too quickly. James woke before his alarm, a habit ingrained from years of military discipline. He went through his morning routine mechanically, but everything felt different now. Each action carried the weight of finality. This would be one of the last times he polished these boots, pressed this uniform, adjusted this cap. The realization sat heavy in his chest, a mixture of grief and relief that he could not quite untangle. In the dining hall, he sat with his fellow guards, men he had served beside through countless shifts. Marcus, who had joined the same year as James and had been his closest friend. William, the veteran who had 20 years of service and could tell stories that made everyone laugh. David, the youngest, who still had that bright-eyed enthusiasm James remembered having once. They joked and talked about the previous day. Completely unaware that James was about to change everything, he wanted to tell them. The words sat on his tongue, heavy and urgent. But something held him back. Maybe it was cowardice, or maybe it was the knowledge that once he spoke the words aloud, there would be no taking them back. His resignation would become real, tangible, irreversible. So he ate his breakfast in silence, laughing at jokes he barely heard, nodding at conversations he could not focus on. After breakfast, James walked to the commanding officer's quarters. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step echoing in a way that felt symbolic. He carried the sealed envelope in his hand, its weight somehow greater than the few sheets of paper it contained. This envelope held his future, or rather, the end of the future he had planned for himself. Colonel Harrison was a stern man in his late 50s, with a military career that commanded respect. He had served in active combat zones before taking on ceremonial duties, and he ran the Queen's Guard with precision and high expectations. James had always admired him, had always worked to meet and exceed those expectations. The thought of disappointing him now made James's stomach twist. He knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps that protocol demanded. The colonel's gruff voice called him in. James entered, standing at attention, the envelope held at his side. Colonel Harrison looked up from his desk, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. He could read soldiers like others read books, and James knew the moment their eyes met that the colonel sensed something was wrong. James crossed the room and placed the envelope on the desk. His hand was steady now, steadier than it had been the night before. He had made his decision, and doubt was a luxury he could no longer afford. Colonel Harrison picked up the envelope, his weathered fingers breaking the seal with practiced efficiency. James remained at attention, watching as the colonel's eyes moved across the page. The silence in the room was deafening. James could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the clock on the wall ticking away seconds that felt like hours. He watched the colonel's face for any reaction, but the older man's expression remained carefully neutral. Years of military training meant emotions were locked away, controlled, never displayed without purpose. Finally, Colonel Harrison set the letter down. He leaned back in his chair, studying James with an intensity that made him want to look away. But James held his gaze, refusing to show weakness, refusing to back down from his decision. Whatever the colonel said, whatever arguments he made, James knew his mind was made up. 12 years, the colonel said finally, his voice measured. 12 years of exemplary service. Your record is flawless. You're in line for promotion. You could make sergeant within 2 years, maybe officer if you pursue it. And you want to throw it all away? James had expected this. He had prepared responses, logical explanations, carefully worded justifications. But standing there in that office, looking at a man he deeply respected, all those prepared words felt hollow. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any explanation he could give. "Sir, I need to step away while I still remember who I am," James said quietly. "I've spent 12 years becoming the perfect guard, and in doing so, I've forgotten how to be a person. Yesterday, someone showed me kindness, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had shown kindness to anyone, including myself." Colonel Harrison's expression shifted slightly, a crack in the neutral facade. "Someone showed you kindness?" he repeated, and there was something in his voice that made James think the colonel understood more than he was saying. James nodded but did not elaborate. The moment with Prince George felt too personal to share, too significant to reduce 2 words in an official conversation. It was enough that it had happened, that it had changed something fundamental inside him. The colonel stood, walking to the window that overlooked the training grounds. Young recruits were drilling below, their movements synchronized. Their faces set in determined expressions James recognized all too well. How many of them would end up like him, he wondered, so focused on duty that they forgot everything else? "I'm not going to try to change your mind," Colonel Harrison said, his back still to James. "I've seen too many good soldiers burn out, push themselves until there's nothing left. Some realize it in time, others don't." He turned back to face James. "You're one of the lucky ones. You're recognizing it before it destroys you." The words hit James harder than any reprimand could have. He had expected anger, disappointment, perhaps even contempt. He had not expected understanding and certainly not approval. His throat tightened, and he had to blink several times to keep his eyes clear. "I'll process your resignation today," the colonel continued, moving back to his desk. "You'll need to complete exit procedures, return your equipment, attend debriefing. Standard protocol. But James," he paused, using his first name for perhaps the first time ever, "don't think of this as failure. You've served with honor. You're leaving because you're choosing life over duty, and there's no shame in that." James saluted, the gesture automatic, but filled with genuine respect. As he turned to leave, the colonel's voice stopped him one more time. "That kindness you mentioned," the colonel said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I heard about a certain young prince leaving water for a guard yesterday. Word travels fast in the palace. Between you and me, I think he showed wisdom beyond his years. And I think you showed wisdom too, understanding what his gesture meant." The next few hours passed in a blur of administrative tasks. James moved through the exit procedures with the same precision he had brought to his duties as a guard. He returned his ceremonial uniform, carefully folding the red tunic he had worn with such pride. The bearskin cap went back into storage, that iconic piece of British pageantry that had sat on his head through rain, sun, and snow. Each item he handed over felt like shedding a layer of identity. In the equipment room, he stood for a moment holding his rifle. It was not loaded, had never been loaded during his ceremonial duties, but it had been a constant companion for 12 years. He had cleaned it thousands of times, had held it at attention until his arms screamed, had learned every scratch and mark on its surface. Handing it over to the quartermaster felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. Word of his resignation had spread through the barracks with the speed of wildfire. By lunchtime, every guard knew that James Patterson was leaving. Some stopped him in hallways, shaking his hand, wishing him well with genuine warmth. Others avoided his eyes, perhaps seeing in his choice a reflection of doubts they carried themselves. Marcus found him in the afternoon, pulling him aside into an empty corridor. "Is it true?" Marcus asked, his face a mixture of shock and concern. "You're really leaving?" James nodded. "I handed in my resignation this morning. I'll be gone by the end of the week." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he only showed around close friends. "Why, James? You're the best guard we have. Everyone knows you're headed for promotion." "What happened?" James considered how much to share. Marcus was his closest friend here, the person he trusted most in the regiment. But even with Marcus, the full truth felt too vulnerable, too raw to expose completely. "I just realized I've been living half a life," James said finally. "Focused entirely on duty, on being perfect, on never showing weakness. Yesterday, something happened that made me see how much I've lost along the way. My relationships, my health, my connection to everything outside these walls. I need to find my way back before it's too late." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor. When he looked up, his eyes were troubled. "I get it," he said softly. "More than you know. Sometimes I stand there for hours, and I feel like I'm disappearing. Like I'm becoming invisible, even to myself. But I thought that was just part of the job, you know? The sacrifice we make doesn't have to be," James replied. "We can serve without erasing ourselves. I just forgot that somewhere along the way, they stood in silence. Two men who had shared countless shifts, who had supported each other through difficult times, who understood each other in ways civilians never could." Finally, Marcus extended his hand. "I'm going to miss you, brother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think you're doing the right thing. Maybe the bravest thing I've seen anyone do in this regiment." James shook his hand, then pulled him into a brief embrace. "Take care of yourself, Marcus. Don't wait as long as I did to remember you're human." The rest of the day was filled with goodbyes, some heartfelt, others awkward. James cleaned out his locker, packing away personal items he had accumulated over the years. Photographs of his family, letters from home, a small stone his nephew had given him for good luck. These small treasures had sustained him through long days and lonely nights. Reminders of a world beyond the palace gates. That evening, James made a phone call he had been putting off. His mother answered on the third ring, her voice bright with surprise at hearing from him on a weekday. "James, is everything all right? You never called during the week." He could hear the worry beneath her cheerfulness. Years of military service had taught her to expect bad news when routines changed. James took a deep breath, steadying himself for what he knew would be an emotional conversation. "Everything's fine, ma'am. Better than fine, actually. I have something to tell you." Paused, then said the words that made everything real. "I've resigned from the Queen's Guard. I'm coming home." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that James wondered if the call had dropped. Then he heard a sound that broke his heart and mended it simultaneously. His mother was crying, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of joy, of a hope she had carried for years, but never voiced. "Oh, James," she whispered. "Oh, my dear boy. I've been praying for this day. I never said anything because I know how much your service means to you, but I've been so worried. You've seemed so distant, so closed off, like you were drifting further and further away from us." James felt his own eyes burning. He had thought he was protecting his family by being strong, by never showing doubt or weakness, but all he had done was push them away, making them watch helplessly as he disappeared into his duties. "I know, ma'am. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. But something happened yesterday that woke me up. Someone showed me kindness when I needed it most, and it made me realize how much I've been missing." They talked for over an hour, the longest conversation James had had with his mother in years. She told him about his sister's new job, his nephew's school play, his father's garden that was flourishing this year. Small, ordinary details of family life that James had been too busy to hear about, too focused on duty to make time for. Now, each detail felt precious, a thread reconnecting him to the life he had left behind. His mother asked what he would do next, and James admitted he did not know. He had no plan beyond leaving, no career lined up, no clear path forward. For the first time in his adult life, he was stepping into uncertainty. And surprisingly, that felt liberating rather than terrifying. "You'll figure it out," his mother said, with the confidence only a mother could have. "You're smart, you're dedicated, and you have skills that translate to so many things. But first, just come home. Rest. Remember what it feels like to be part of a family again." After they hung up, James sat in his room feeling lighter than he had in years. The decision was made, the wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. Tomorrow he would complete more exit procedures. The day after, he would have his final debriefing. And by the end of the week, he would walk out of these barracks as a civilian, free to rebuild the life he had neglected. James's final days at Windsor Castle took on a dreamlike quality. Everything he had done thousands of times before now carried the weight of finality. His last morning run around the training grounds, his last meal in the dining hall, his last inspection of his quarters. Each moment was both ordinary and profound. Mundane tasks transformed into farewells. On his second-to-last day, something unexpected happened. James was completing paperwork in the administrative office when a staff member approached him with a message. He was requested to meet with someone in the blue drawing room at 2 o'clock. The message gave no indication of who wanted to meet him, which was unusual enough to make James nervous. When he arrived at the specified room, he found himself being led inside by a private secretary he had seen around the palace but never spoken to. The blue drawing room was stunning, with its ornate decorations and priceless artwork. James had stood guard near it many times, but had never been inside. He felt suddenly aware of how out of place he was, a soldier in a space meant for royalty and dignitaries. The door opened and James's breath caught in his throat. Prince William entered, followed by a more hesitant Prince George. The young prince looked nervous, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes darting to his father for reassurance. James immediately stood at attention, years of training overriding his shock. "At ease, please," Prince William said with a warm smile. "This is not an official matter. We wanted to speak with you before you left." He placed a hand on George's shoulder. George actually insisted on it. The young prince stepped forward, his nervousness giving way to determination. He looked directly at James, and in those young eyes, James saw the same compassion that had changed his life days earlier. "I heard. You're leaving," George said, his voice quiet but steady. "My father told me it's because of what I did, giving you the water. I wanted to make sure you're not in trouble because of me." James felt his throat tighten. The young prince had been worried about him, concerned that his act of kindness had caused problems. The thoughtfulness of it, the genuine care from someone so young who carried the weight of future kingship, was almost overwhelming. "Your Royal Highness," James began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I'm not in trouble, but you've... That day was the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time. You reminded me of something I had forgotten. Something important about being human and treating others with compassion. I'm leaving because I need to find my way back to that, and I could not have done it without your help." George's face relaxed into a relieved smile. "I'm glad. I saw you standing there for so long in the heat, and I just thought you might need water. My mom always tells us to notice when people need help, and to help them if we can." Prince William's expression showed pride in his son, and James understood why. In a world where royalty could easily become disconnected from the everyday struggles of ordinary people, George had been taught to see and care. That lesson would serve him well when he eventually became king. "Your son did more than offer water," James said, looking at Prince William. "He showed me that real strength is not about standing rigid and emotionless. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and acting on it. That's a lesson I needed to learn, and I'm grateful he taught it to me." Prince William nodded thoughtfully. "We heard about your resignation from Colonel Harrison. He spoke very highly of you and said your service has been exemplary. I wanted to personally thank you for your dedication to protecting my family. Guards like you are the reason we can move freely and safely, and that's something we never take for granted." The prince reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. This is not an official commendation, just a personal thank you from our family to yours." He handed the box to James, who opened it to find a set of cufflinks bearing the Prince of Wales's feathers. "For when you wear civilian clothes," William added with a smile. "Something to remember that your service mattered and was appreciated." James was speechless. He had expected a quiet departure, a few handshakes, and then civilian life. Not expected this recognition, this personal acknowledgement from the future king himself. The gesture touched him more deeply than any medal or promotion could have. "I don't know what to say," James managed. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. This means more than you know." George spoke up again, his voice stronger now. "Will you be happy, do you think, when you leave here?" It was such a simple question, asked with such genuine concern, that James felt tears prick his eyes for the second time that week. He knelt down so he was at George's eye level, breaking protocol one final time. "I think so," James said honestly. "I'm going to spend time with my family, figure out what comes next, and remember how to be a person again. You helped me realize I needed to do that, and I'll always be grateful." George smiled, that bright, unself-conscious smile of childhood. Good. Everyone deserves to be happy. The meeting lasted only a few more minutes. Prince William asked about James's plans, offered words of encouragement, and shared a few stories about other guards who had moved on to successful civilian careers. George stood quietly beside his father, occasionally adding a comment or question, showing the intelligence and empathy that would someday make him a good king. As James left the blue drawing room, he felt something shift inside him. For days, he had been wrestling with guilt and doubt, wondering if he was making a mistake, if he was throwing away something valuable. But this conversation had given him peace. His service had mattered. He had protected people who appreciated that protection. And now he was leaving not because he had failed, but because he had recognized when it was time to move on. That night, James lay in his narrow bed for the last time. Tomorrow would be his final day, a few hours of paperwork and official goodbyes, and then he would walk out of these gates as a civilian. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than fear. He thought about Prince George's question. "Will you be happy?" James had spent so long focusing on duty, honor, and service that he had forgotten happiness was even an option. But now, lying in the darkness, he realized that happiness was not just an option, but a responsibility. He owed it to himself, to his family, and even to the institution he had served. Happy people made better protectors, better servants, better humans. By choosing happiness, he was not abandoning his values, but honoring them in a different way. James woke on his last day to the sound of rain against the windows. It seemed fitting somehow, this gray English morning marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. He went through his morning routine one final time, but instead of his uniform, he dressed in civilian clothes. The jeans and sweater felt strange after years of crisp military dress, like wearing someone else's skin. The final paperwork took less time than expected. James signed documents, received copies of his service record, and listened to briefings about veteran benefits and resources. The administrative staff were efficient but kind, treating him with respect rather than the dismissiveness he had feared. They had seen many soldiers leave over the years and understood that departure was not failure, but transition. Colonel Harrison called him in for a final meeting. The older man stood when James entered, a gesture of respect that surprised him. They shook hands and the colonel gestured to a chair across from his desk. "I've been thinking about our conversation," the colonel said, "about duty and humanity and finding balance. It made me examine my own service, my own sacrifices. I've given 40 years to the military and I'm proud of that. But I've also missed my children growing up, buried myself in work when my marriage fell apart, and convinced myself that was noble rather than cowardly." James listened, honored that this man he respected so deeply was sharing something so personal. "You're leaving at 35, the colonel continued. "You have time to build a different life, to find that balance. I'm 63, and while I don't regret my service, I do regret what I gave up for it. Learn from my mistakes, James. Serve your community, serve your family, but don't forget to serve yourself too. You can't pour from an empty cup, as they say." They talked for another hour, not as commanding officer and subordinate, but as two men who had shared an experience and were now reflecting on what it meant. The colonel shared stories James had never heard, moments of doubt and struggle that revealed the human beneath the uniform. It was the greatest gift the colonel could have given him, this honesty, this vulnerability that military culture so often discouraged. When James finally left the office, Colonel Harrison saluted him, a final acknowledgement of his service. James returned the salute with precision, then extended his hand. They shook, soldiers recognizing each other's worth. And then James walked out, knowing he would probably never see the colonel again. His fellow guards had organized a small gathering in the common room. Nothing official, just coffee and biscuits, but the gesture touched James deeply. These men had been his brothers, his companions through long shifts and difficult days. They shared memories, laughed about mishaps that had seemed disastrous at the time, but were funny in retrospect, and made promises to stay in touch that they all knew would be difficult to keep. Marcus pulled James aside one last time. "I've been thinking about what you said," he confessed. "About living half a life. I'm not ready to leave yet, but I'm going to make some changes. Call my sister more. Take my vacation days. Remember, there's a world outside these walls. You showed me that's possible." James gripped his friend's shoulder. "That's all any of us can do. Find our own balance, our own path. There's no shame in staying, just like there's no shame in leaving. We're all just trying to figure it out." By noon, everything was done. James walked through the barracks one last time, his bag slung over his shoulder, containing everything he owned that mattered. 12 years of his life fit into one duffel bag. A humbling realization that made him think about what really held value. Not the medals or commendations, but the relationships, the experiences. The lessons learned at the main gate. He paused and looked back at Windsor Castle. The ancient stones had witnessed centuries of history, of kings and queens, of wars and peace, of soldiers like him who had stood guard and then moved on. He was just one small part of that endless chain of service, and there was comfort in that. His departure would not diminish the institution. Others would take his place, stand his post, protect the royal family with the same dedication he had shown. But he hoped that somewhere among them, there would be guards who remembered they were human first and soldiers second, who accepted kindness when it was offered and offered kindness in return, who understood that strength included vulnerability and that the greatest courage was sometimes admitting you needed to change. James stepped through the gate into the civilian world beyond. Rain was still falling, cool and cleansing on his face. He had no job waiting, no clear plan, no roadmap for this new life, but he had something more valuable. He had himself back, reclaimed from years of gradual disappearance. He had family waiting for him, ready to welcome him home. And he had a lesson from a 10-year-old prince who had reminded him that seeing people's humanity and responding to it was the most important duty of all. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "What time will you arrive? Your father is making your favorite dinner. We can't wait to see you." James smiled, a genuine expression that felt strange on his face after years of practiced neutrality. He typed back quickly, then started walking toward the train station. Each step took him further from the life he had known and closer to the life he was choosing. The rain continued to fall, washing away the past, making everything clean and new. He thought about Prince George one last time. About that bottle of water placed carefully at his feet. About those young eyes that had seen what others missed. The young prince would grow up to be king someday, would carry responsibilities that James could barely imagine. But if he maintained that compassion, that ability to notice when people needed help and to help them without hesitation, he would be a good king. More than that, he would be a good person. Which was perhaps more important. James reached the station and bought his ticket home. As he sat on the platform waiting for the train, he pulled out the box Prince William had given him and opened it again. The cufflinks gleamed in the gray light, beautiful and meaningful. He would wear them proudly, not as symbols of rank or achievement, but as reminders. Reminders that service mattered, that his years had not been wasted, but also that service took many forms. Protecting people was important, but so was being present for your family, taking care of your health, maintaining your humanity. The train arrived, and James boarded, finding a seat by the window. As the train pulled away from Windsor, he watched the castle recede into the distance. Growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared from view, he felt no regret, only gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to serve, for the lessons learned, for the discipline and dedication that would serve him well in whatever came next. But most of all, he felt gratitude for a young prince who had shown kindness to a guard who had forgotten he needed it. That simple act had saved James in ways that Prince George would probably never fully understand. It had reminded him that beneath every uniform, every role, every mask we wear, there is a person who deserves to be seen and cared for. As the English countryside rolled past his window, James thought about the future. Maybe he would find work that let him help others, use his skills in security or training or mentoring. Maybe he would take time to figure out who he was when he was not defined by duty. Maybe he would struggle, stumble, and have to figure things out as he went. But whatever happened, he would face it as himself, whole and human. Rather than as a fragment of a person playing a role, the train carried him toward home, toward his family, toward a future unwritten and full of possibility. And for the first time in 12 years, James Patterson felt truly at peace. He had served with honor, and now he was choosing to live with purpose. Both were valuable, both were important, and recognizing when to transition from one to the other was perhaps the greatest. Wisdom of all, outside the rain continued to fall. But inside the train, James was warm and dry, heading home to people who loved him, carrying with him the lessons of service, sacrifice, and ultimately, the courage to choose himself. The royal guard who had stood motionless for hours was now moving forward into life. And there was something beautifully poetic about that transformation. From statue to human, from duty to living, from rigid discipline to flexible growth, Prince George had given him water that day, but in doing so, he had given him something far more precious. He had given him permission to be human again, and James would spend the rest of his life honoring that gift.